Welcome. This is the EUI series on the crisis of expert knowledge and authority. I'm Adélie Chevée, and today we're going to talk about the role of economists in influencing policymaking during the COVID-19 pandemic. To do this, I'm interviewing Aditya Goenka, who is professor of economics at the University of Birmingham. Professor Goenka studies the interaction between the economy and infectious disease. But in the last 2 years, Professor Goenka was part of the UK government's International Best Practices Advisory Group. So in other words, he was one of very few economists engaged in advising the UK government in its response to COVID. Professor Goenka, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Adélie. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
So the first question that I'd like to ask you is about your research. In the last decade, so long before the pandemic started, you've been studying the relationship between infectious disease and the economy. You've looked at what we may call economic epidemiology modeling. Could you please tell us a little bit more about these models and what they help us to understand?
Yes, my first interest in this interaction of infectious diseases and the economy arose when I went to Singapore in 2003, just in the aftermath of the SARS crisis. And I could see that while developing countries have been afflicted by infectious diseases like malaria and a whole host of other diseases, developed economies can also be impacted very severely by infectious disease pandemics. And when I looked around the literature, I realized that very little had been done by economists to model the interaction of infectious diseases and the economy. Now, I am an economic theorist, so motivated by practical problems, and I realized that this way of thinking about interaction of disease and the economy was also very interesting from a theoretical perspective because it raised certain challenges which in economics had not been addressed before. So I started thinking about how to model interaction of diseases and the economy way before the COVID pandemic. And at that time, our motivation was, my co-author's motivation was what was going on in East Asia. We had a lot of scares, as well as what was happening in other developing countries which have endemic diseases like HIV, dengue, different waterborne diseases, malaria, etc.
Okay, so a difference that we had with COVID compared to those diseases, but that government had to make the decision to do lockdowns, right? So at the start of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, governments were trying to avoid an economic crisis in addition to the health emergency. If you order lockdowns, you might slow the spread of the disease, but this can also have catastrophic consequences for people's livelihoods. This has been understood sometimes as the trade-off between health and wealth. And in one of your latest papers, co-authored with Dr. Liu and Nguyen, you evaluate the idea of optimal lockdown. Can you explain this a little bit to us?
Yes. First of all, I should say that, what we did before the pandemic, actually, a lot of our insights were born by the COVID pandemic. Other countries had faced similar challenges, like the SARS epidemic, the Ebola epidemic in West Africa, the MERS epidemic. These are recent epidemics in Middle East, and going back to the Great Flu at the turn of the 20th century after the First World War. Now, clearly, for new diseases like COVID, there were no treatments available. There were no vaccinations. There was no therapeutics to treat people who are ill with the pandemic. So what was already understood, if you stop interaction of people, then you'd slow down the transmission of disease. So for example, if you go around the ports of Italy, like Ancona, for example, which I visited a few years ago, there's a fortified area that people coming in from overseas trade had to quarantine before they could go into the general population. So this idea is an old idea. It's a very blunt idea that if you prevent people from interacting, this transmission of disease will slow down. However, once we do that, there's an impact on economic activity. So the question is, how do we think about locking down how much of the economy? And what this paper is trying to do is it's trying to do several things. It's trying to understand how different parameters which are important, like ability to work from home, compliance with quarantines or lockdowns, the characteristics of the disease, because what we have found with COVID, vaccinations it's not the end of the story, because we can get mutations of the virus which escape immunity, and the new virus which is circulating, BA.5, escapes immunity from prior infection and prior vaccination. So we have to think about how to deal with the disease in the longer run. My feeling is that disease is not going to go away immediately. So we have to think about these trade-offs. And this paper is trying to work out how these different parameters are going to affect how much of the economy to lock down. A related point is what sectors of the economy to lock down. For example, do we close schools? Do we stop people going to restaurants and pubs? Do we stop people to attend sports events, etc.? So we have to think about not just optimal decision, amount of lockdown for ourselves and for the whole economy, but maybe more targeted lockdowns may be necessary going forward. In that paper, we don't address that, but at least we provide a framework to think about what is actually going on. If I may just say a further thing, the UK government, for example, is acting as if the pandemic is over. There are pretty much no restrictions left in the country. People don't wear masks and there are no restrictions on COVID. But what we are seeing is that infections is leading to high pressure in hospitals. Mortality is low from the disease because the most vulnerable sections of the population are double or triple vaccinated. But what infections are doing, that's morbidity, not deaths, mortality. Morbidity is causing a lot of havoc in the economy because the labor market is tight. And if there are some people who do not turn up for work because of illnesses, then the whole economy grinds to halt. So for example, in UK, air travel is in a big mess. It's not the case in other European countries, as far as I understand. But UK has a severe problem because of just illness of people. So thinking about how to deal with the pandemic in the longer run, we have to take into account that the disease is with vaccinations. And that's one of the things which we do in the paper, is take into account how mutations of the disease may affect what actions we should take.
Okay. There's something that I'm particularly interested in this paper, is that you're trying to account the fact that some populations, especially low-paid workers who often are frontline workers, they don't have the same ability to organize work from home. And actually, work from home for them can be very difficult, and if they don't do it, they are more exposed to the disease. How do you protect those vulnerable populations and avoid an increase in economic inequalities? This is something, and I'd like to ask as well, is this something that was taken into account by the UK government when you discussed about possible optimal lockdowns?
Yes, I mean, clearly the government was aware of this problem. It was clearly aware of them, but once you go to the entire policy making, moved from a general lockdown, the country did use targeted lockdowns. It did use lockdowns in certain areas of the country. But the problem was that those lockdowns took place in parts of the country like the East Midlands, where there were a lot of people who were frontline workers who did not have the ability to work primarily from the home. One of the things which could have been done, which was done in some countries, was when the vaccination program was rolled out, some countries chose to vaccinate frontline workers first. Singapore was one of them. It realized that the logistics was essential for the country to function. So even the airline crew were the first people to be vaccinated, and logistics workers were the first people to be vaccinated, amongst the first. But in UK, the policy was clearly to prevent mortality, and it went from the most vulnerable people to the other section of the population. Now, some of the people who are these frontline workers are younger workers. So they ended up being more exposed to infections. But it's very difficult to say what is the right way to go about choosing vaccination policies. I wrote an article for Economic Observatory, which said that different countries have chosen very different routes to vaccinate people. And vaccination is clearly one thing which does help. The other thing is to give income support. Now, the problem with some of the frontline workers is that they are working in what are called zero-hour contracts. If they do not come to work, they do not get paid. So it becomes a double challenge that if someone is exposed to the infection, may need to get vaccine, may need to isolate, that person's ability to isolate is very low. For me, it actually is not a big deal. I'm a university professor. I was teaching online. I set up my office. You can see I've set up my study. I could just work from home. It really made no difference to me at a level, if I'm honest, what was going on outside. That is not the case for large segments of the population. I'm a university contract. I have sick leave. If I'm sick for longer, I'll still get paid, which is not the case for frontline workers. So vaccinations and income support, but this is a challenge because these frontline workers have very little income support and paid medical leave.
Okay, so we've talked about your research, the reason why governments would turn to you for advice. Is it easy to define the boundaries of your area of expertise and its potential relevance for science advice, which is something that our cluster of research is more interested in?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that because clearly I was one of the few people, me and my co-authors were among the few people who were thinking about this issue prior to the pandemic. So when they looked for experts, I was one of the few people who had expertise in that area. But actually in the government work, it was not only to think about my expertise, but was also think widely, because the government panel I was on was interdisciplinary panel. We had epidemiologists, political scientists, geneticists, statisticians, nursing experts, medical experts. I was only, some health economists, some people working for the government. So we were also thinking more widely than just narrowly about our area.
So this is the scientific advisory group, right?
Yes.
We're mostly familiar indeed with epidemiologists and medical doctors and how they advise government, but there were economists too. Can you tell us, so in this advisory group, what was your role exactly? And can you perhaps give us an example of a science advice that you gave?
So my role was threefold, I would say. One was to talk about my expertise and these trade-offs between health and wealth. Generally people think that there is a trade-off between health and wealth. Yes and no, because what we also see is that if the disease persists, it has bad effects on the economy. So, the economy is also, moves in the same direction as infections. So that was one thing which is not really appreciated by people who haven't studied the problem. That was one thing. The second thing was to generally talk about the economics literature and what economists have contributed, which would inform government policy in the areas which were brought forward to us. That's the second thing, the general economics literature. And the third thing which we also asked to do is to also think about what is happening in other countries. Because the name is international advisory, because one of the things which the government was interested was what is the best practice, international best practices in other countries, right? Everyone is saying, you're doing this in UK, but what is being done in Italy? What's being done in South Korea, and etc. So we were also tasked to think about what is the best practices, what we can learn from other countries, as well as what are the things we should not do. So we had to use our contacts and our knowledge of other countries. So most of the people in that group had some international exposure, had an international connection. So, I said that Europe can be covered by my colleagues much better. I'd lived in Singapore for 12 years. And, I follow the news in South Asia and Southeast Asia, given my interest. So I said, okay, I'll talk about that region and maybe even African countries, which I don't follow. But then I had another colleague who was much more familiar with Africa. So, it was also to bring in the international experience to inform policy, to the three things: my own expertise, general economics literature, and international experience.
Okay, and what is the most memorable moment you have in terms of really a moment when you felt that you or maybe your colleagues as well were trying really to convey an advice or pushing for a solution that you thought was worth listening to?
Okay, this is a bit tricky because we follow what are called the Chatham House rules that, when we say certain things, it's never minuted who said what. That is one of the things. And secondly, there are many different advice going into the Prime Minister's office, and that's something that comes out of it. I talked about that in my seminar. So, but there were certain things which I thought were very important, and I kept on pushing throughout. One was, what does the economics literature help in terms of thinking about problems, about distinguishing correlations between variables, which other disciplines often look at correlations, but economists are very worried about causality. And what are the tools economists can use to back out the effect of an intervention on an outcome? Because the intervention is also in response to the infection. The intervention is not something that comes out of thin air. That was one of the things. The issues of inequality, which we talked about, ethnic inequality, geographical inequality, other demographics, inequalities in terms of deprivation in the country. Some of the things which people do not appreciate, for example, when we have we got these apps to track infections. Now, I had an old phone. It was an old iPhone, which I didn't want to upgrade. I could not download it in my phone. And I know, for example, my parents who are much older, their ability to use these apps is much more limited right now. So issues of even digital exclusion, which I would point out. Some things which I was also very keen that we do was, initially the government was not publicizing disaggregated data. It was available. But I said, we should really publish disaggregate data, what is infection, not only in Birmingham, but around my area, because Birmingham is a city of like 5 million people, but it's a big city. So If I know what are infections around me, then I can make an informed decision. And there were a whole lot of other things, which you push for, but there are many voices in the committee. And eventually, what can go to the Prime Minister's office is a short document, because the policymakers have only a limited time to think about the problem. They are getting advice from many different channels. So I hope some of the things I said, I feel some of them did get reflected, but it's very difficult for me on record to say I did that.
No, I understand. There's a trade-off also that you have to make between communication and being able to communicate and to give fast information to politicians in order for them to make decisions quickly when they don't have all the accumulated knowledge that you have. What impact do you think had the advices of the International Best Practices Advisory Group, this group that was looking at what was going on in the rest of the world? What was the impact, and would you say it had influence on the government?
Clearly, it did have an influence, and clearly, often we got questions from the, these are the questions which the policymakers are interested in. And at times we took certain position. And in several instances, we could clearly see an action being taken. It's, what we were told that what we do is all secret. We had to cite the secrecy laws. The reason for doing that, unlike for other government bodies, like in UK, there's another organization called SAGE, its minutes are publicized. Now, SAGE is a purely academic expert group, scientific advisory group, scientific advisory group on emergencies. Now, the thing that my group also got was, intelligence from the foreign, the foreign posts. We call them foreign posts. Yeah, the scientific attaches and so on, who talk to people in other countries. Like normally that's what they do. They talk to people and they get some insight, but it cannot be put on record. So that information was also being fed into the report. So as a result, what we did is still classified information, because it was based on classified information. I think so. At that time, it was sensitive in terms of, we think country A is going to do this, country B is going to do that, based on, their understanding of what is happening on the ground in a country. Now, if you look at it on hindsight, it does not seem very information. But at that time, the people also make conjectures what different countries are likely to do.
So it's interesting what you're saying about confidentiality. Does it mean that in order to do expertise to government, you always need to have a certain level of confidentiality, or do you also have to think about transparency, as you talked earlier about sharing data?
Yeah, so there is a trade-off. There is a trade-off. Now, sometimes all governments use some confidential information. They use public information. If there was any public indicator which the government was not considering, we were asked to convey that. So a lot of it was based on publicly available information, which was there in the time of COVID. Indicators were widely available. But what was not public was the government's assessment or Foreign Office assessment that this is what we think. For example, Italy is thinking about how to deal with a rise in cases in 2 months' time. That, is difficult to actually verify, because that assessment could be right or wrong. That's an assessment. They may talk to, health officials in Italy. They could talk to other people in the foreign, in the offices, businessmen, the normal people, foreign officers talk to, and make an assessment. Now that in assessment about intentions is, it's very difficult to say that is this right or wrong. So we were asked to sign confidentiality agreements because those assessments, cannot be pinned down. I was hoping that, as a result, I'd be delivered Aston Martin, and but never happened. So yeah, so we did have to be careful that these deliberations were confidential because some of the sources were confidential. It was nothing very dramatic if you look at it.
So what happens when you are actually having an opinion that you want to bring into the room, but that you think might not be reflecting the general consensus?
That's a very interesting and a very important point. It's something that, we need to think about when we are engaged in policymaking. So in my case, the work we did was purely voluntary. It was unpaid. And when I was engaged in this work, I was thinking, given that I'm an expert who is giving advice, what should I do? Should I just go with the general consensus, or should I raise points which I think are important, but which are not being addressed? And I realized that if you rock the boat too much, you may not be on the boat anymore. But eventually, I felt that what we were doing, all of us were doing, was doing our best for the welfare of society. Clearly, we were there to save lives, and anything one could say to save lives, to make hardship lower, is worth it. So at times, I would say things which were against the general consensus. I realized that, I could not be in the committee anymore, but eventually it's something to think about. Why you being engaged in policy making? For some people, it is a career option, and then their incentives are different. This was a matter of emergency, international emergency. And one has to be, I think, intellectually honest to say what is intellectually and morally the right thing. Clearly, we're not in the cabinet where you are told that, you have to follow the cabinet's line. If you disagree with the cabinet's line, you have to resign. We were not in that situation. We were clearly told that you can have your independent views as experts. You can talk to the press, which is not often the case. Like SAGE was prohibited from talking to the press. My committee members were engaged with the press. So several of us took positions which was critical of the government policy. But I think so we also had to recognize, and I spoke to my colleagues at some point. We said, clearly this is obvious. Why aren't we doing it? And one of my colleagues who has been involved in policymaking for many years said the following. He said, eventually you are one of many voices which goes to the government, and you have to say what you think is right. It may stick, it may not stick. So I said, at least from my point of view, I want to say things which I think I can go to sleep with. If they don't stick, I know I've made my point. And I do have to have humility to know that I'm not the only person giving advice. And I think so that was a important learning experience for me.
Maybe my final question would be about the role of economic advice to government, and in particular economic epidemiology modeling, those models
Yes.
that you're trying to do. How do you see the interaction between this field and politics, not only in the UK, but in the world in the future?
I think so. It is very important because what we have seen countries which had experiences of pandemics in the recent past. And I think of countries in the Pacific Rim, largely dealt with the pandemic better in the earlier period in terms of controlling mortality. Even countries in West Africa, the state of Kerala in India, where they'd had experience, they had some institutional knowledge how to deal with it. Countries in the West largely did not think that pandemics are a serious problem. In fact, I gave a seminar many years ago, and a Nobel Prize winner told me, "You're wasting your time. This is not something we worry about anymore." So I think what we have seen is that new pandemics emerge. There's a scare of a monkeypox. There's also climate change taking place. So the extent, of the ecosystem, the interaction, the ecosystem is changing. And, as climate change takes place, diseases like malaria, which were eradicated largely in Europe, may enter into certain parts of Europe because of, the climatic changes. So we have to start thinking about dealing with infectious diseases. In UK, there was a pandemic of BSE many years, maybe 20 odd years, maybe 30 odd years ago, mad cow disease. And then there was other diseases, but, reports were commissioned, they were written, but people just moved on. And I think so one of the things which is important is that most countries in Europe and OECD countries don't have health systems which can deal with infectious diseases. They're largely geared towards aging diseases. So one of the things which happened early in the pandemic, people would say, and policymakers would say, it's not a problem for us because if you look at per capita expenditure in Europe, it's far higher than other countries. So it's not going to be a problem for us. But my point was, it's actually going to hit us hardest because people do not understand what an infectious disease is, and the health system is totally not geared towards it. So my hope is that, we have learned. We do not dismantle the expertise, academic expertise, as well as the expertise which is there in the medical sphere, and move on. We should actually retain, hopefully these are going to be very rare events, but when these rare events do take place, we should be able to deal with them.
And therefore to use this accumulated expertise and knowledge for the future.
Yes,
important questions.
Yeah.
Well, we've reached the end of our time. Thanks a lot for this conversation, Professor Goenka, and we hope to see more of you of your work in the future.
Thank you very much, Adélie. Pleasure talking to you.